The New Centers of the Sphere. William Ospina. Colombian writer, novelist, and critic born in the Herveo municipality of the Tolima department. The New Centers of the Sphere. The New Face of the Latin Planet. A short time ago, in Paris, questioned by journalists about how Ibero-America is defending itself from the cultural invasion of the time, Gabriel Garcia Marquez replied that he did not feel so much that they are invading us, but rather that it is we, Latin Americans, who are culturally invading the world. He added that it was remarkable the way in which the literature, arts, music, crafts, customs, and gastronomy of our America made their way into the contemporary world. It is true, at the time of the so-called Latin American literary boom, whose very name is an expression that it was not a local phenomenon, the presence of our cultures in the societies of the planet was already beginning to be noticeable, and since then it has become more and more its influence perceptible. But since the 30s of the last century, when tango began to be danced in Paris, since the 40s, when Jorge Luis Borges' world of infinite objects and magical libraries began to be frequented by the French, when the Caribbean bolero and sones orchestras carried their rhythm everywhere, when Mexican cinema began to be seen, and when Pablo Neruda wrote his Residence on Earth and his General Song, since the 1950s, when Pérez Prado's Mambos, Juan Rulfo's narrative and the romantic beginnings of the Cuban Revolution were felt at the same time. And since the 1960s, when Julio Cortázar, Jorge Amado, Mario Vargas Llosa, João Guimarães Rosa, Carlos Fuentes, José Lezama Lima, Alejo Carpentier, Ernesto Sabato, Ernesto Cardenal, Miguel Angel Asturias and Gabriel Garcia Marquez himself became our greatest writers of the century, and some of them true living legends, the progression has not stopped growing. A phenomenon that occurred, in parallel, became increasingly visible to us, that the plastic arts of Latin America had also made their way in the Western world, since the times of the great Mexican muralists and Uruguayan artists Pedro Figueroa Torres Garcia, including Frida Kahlo, Remedios Varo, Edgar Negrete, Eduardo Ramirez Villamizar, Armando Rabaran, Soto, Cuevas, Guayas Aman, Desislo, Bravo, Obregon, Caballero, or Morales, among many others, and achieved legendary fame with names like Orozco, Diego Rivera, Wilfredo Lam, or Fernando Botero. Already in the 1950s, the books of Pedro Henriquez Urena, the great Dominican polygraph, showed the colossal fresco of a completely interdependent continental literary and aesthetic culture, which, of course, also included Brazil, and also mentioned the excellence of composers such as Carlos Chavez de Mexico, author of notable symphonic pieces, like the Argentine Alberto Ginastera, author of a famous opera inspired by the novel Bomarzo by Manuel Mujica Lainez, or like the Brazilian maestro Heitor Villa-Lobos, whose unusual ensembles of instruments and string quartets have marked an epoch in contemporary music. But, of course, that presence of ours in the world is more immediately perceptible in the crowd of mestizo faces that fill the cities of the United States, in the Chicanos of Los Angeles, in the Mexican, Peruvian, or Cuban food restaurants that abounded in Nueva York and Miami, in the Andean music ensembles that play in those of the Paris subway, in those boats anchored in the Thames, not far from Big Ben, where swarms of incorrigible Colombians drink brandy and hear songs of spite, in fact that the television networks with the most audiences in the United States are the so-called Hispanic networks. This is due, equally, to the fact that there are more and more Latin American emigrants, and also to the fact that the planetary intercommunication process necessarily favors those who have more to show and say, and Latin American cultural diversity is one of the most notable, although not yet among the best known, in the world. Those immigrants arrived in waves to Europe and the United States, Cubans in exile, Mexicans in search of work, Chileans thrown out by Pinochet, Argentines and Uruguayans persecuted by their dictatorships, Colombians expelled by violence, Brazilians, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Peruvians, who seek a better future in rich countries, and who, believing that they carry only their needs and their illusions, also carry with them their languages, their traditions, their customs, and a singular nostalgia with a spirit of bolero and son and tango. A curious nostalgia that the English, the French or the Italians do not seem to feel in their relationship with their world of origin. But what people are these who, despite their enormous diversity, are perceived by the world as a single people, and have deserved, by one of those curious somersaults in which history is pleased, to inherit the name of one of the most illustrious traditions cultural aspects of the planet, until they are generically called Latinos. To question its genesis is to look at the most decisive of the historical events of modernity, it is to look into the heart of the West and see an age of iron and blood that slowly and inexorably, to the rhythm of its agonies and its hopes, is changing in eloquence and in music. When we talk about the discovery of America, we tend to look at it as a historical moment and as a geographical fact, the apex of fortune in the age of discoveries, the moment in which the two faces of the planet, until then totally separated, looked at each other. First time. It is amazing to think that until just 5 centuries ago the Atlantic Ocean, which is today the route of many of our migrations, was a marine extension that had practically never been visited by human beings. Some lost dragon of those tireless travelers, the Vikings, had touched the shores of Newfoundland, and had left some silver coins forgotten in its forests, but the discovery adventure of the Norse left no trace in history. The Spanish discovery later marked the beginning of the greatest empire known until then, and made Carlos V say that in his dominions the sun did not set, because when it set over the golden mountains of California it was already dawning over the Philippine Islands, and when he was hiding in Manila he was looming over the last pine groves of Germany. But America was not another point of arrival for Europeans. It was, in many ways, an extension of their civilization, and linked their destiny to the destiny of Europe in a way that was never fully realized in Asia or Africa. Neither Alexander Hellenized Persia, nor Julius Caesar Romanized Egypt, nor Rome Latinized Carthage or Asia Minor, and the truth is that afterwards neither the English Europeanized India and China, nor the French managed to bring the Cartesian spirit to life. Indo-Chinese Peninsula. From the discovery, America was a vast and complex laboratory of ethnic mixtures and cultural fusions, although for a long time these convergences and those functions were outside the gaze and consciousness of the great Western culture. For Europe, America meant a sudden expansion of the available territory, and the truth is that in little more than 4 centuries some 100 million immigrants arrived here. Today it is our countries that send their displaced and their disinherited in search of a future to more fortunate lands, but it should not be forgotten that America was, in other times, the refuge of humanity, and that in our continent they found their home and their destiny. Millions of human beings exiled by hunger, wars, and tyrannies. Perhaps never in history have there been such massive displacements of human beings as those that came to America, not even when the hordes of Indo-Europeans advanced to occupy Europe, nor when the Roman Empire took over the known world, nor when the Moors occupied the northern reaches of the Mediterranean, nor when the hosts of Genghis Khan swept across Asia. The Spanish occupied the Caribbean, advanced on the kingdoms of the Aztecs in 1521, of the Incas in 1532 and of the Chibchas in 1538. Later, the Portuguese occupied the very extensive Brazilian region, and only a century after the discoveries, when the Caribbean, the former territories of the native empires, and these regions of Tierra Firme were occupied by the conquerors, the process of colonization of the territory began. North American. In the United States and Canada, native populations were practically exterminated, and thus colonization consisted of a transfer of vast populations to a rich world that had never been exploited. In the Aztec, Caribbean, Inca, Equinoctial, and Southern America, large regions conserved their majority indigenous population, all received the abundant contribution of the Iberian peoples, and others experienced the gradual incorporation of the African world, since quite possibly only from Africa were brought to our continent, as slaves, some 15 million people. This marked the main difference between the worlds of the North and the South of the American continent. It seems that the North became an extension of European culture, overshadowed by slavery, although renewed by the biblical sensation of populating the Promised Land, and by the Adamic consciousness of starting a world. Nowhere does that cry of novelty, that sensation of dawn, and one almost say, that murmur of paradise resounds so strongly as in the work of the great poet of the New World, Walt Whitman, the son of Manhattan. Latin America, while paying its wealth to Europe for 3 centuries, experienced something very different, the fusion in different degrees of the cultures of the 3 continents, which formed our first great cultural mosaic, mostly white countries of European origin, such as Argentina, Uruguay, and to some extent Chile, predominantly indigenous countries, such as Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, mostly mulatto countries, such as Brazil, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti or Jamaica, and mestizo countries, such as Colombia or Nicaragua, which are neither predominantly white, nor indigenous, nor African, but rather have a large number of racial and cultural mixtures. In ancient times, Rome was a vast empire, and it brought the great Latin language to all peoples and to many of its inhabitants the status of civitas, of citizens. But after its fall an age of disintegration ensued, where each town closed itself in its borders, the great continental routes were abandoned, the economy and politics assumed to form locals, and forests and roads were filled with highwaymen and dangers, propitiating for centuries. Thanks to the isolation, the dismemberment of the common language in regional dialects. Thus arose Spanish, from the mixture of Latin with the Celt-Iberian languages, Portuguese, as a particular form of Latin on the shores of Iberia, is how French arose, which allied Latin with the Gallic languages, thus arose Tuscan, as a popular form of Latin in central Italy, and thus arose Romanian, from the mixture of Latin with the Slavic languages. Even English, a derivation of the Old Anglo-Saxon, was loaded with words of Latin origin, since the British Isles had been the last border of the Roman Empire. And that is how a great language of civilization disappeared from the world, not by death, but by fragmentation into local dialects. However, the paths of history are complex and unpredictable. No one could think, in times when the Roman Empire was dying and the Romance dialects were strengthened, that some of them would become, 1,000 years later, once again great planetary languages. None of them have had the curious luck that Spanish and Portuguese had. But it is that with the information of the great Iberian Empire of Carlos V, in the 16th century, the foundations of the new economic era were also laid, at the birth, thanks to the metal traffic of America, world trade. For this reason, when the empire disintegrated, when the independence of the Ibero-American nations reached the beginning of the 19th century, the countries were not fully isolated as in times of the decline of Rome, and the growing phenomenon of globalization has found us in possession of vigorous and enriched common languages. However, few stories as exemplary as the enrichment of these languages. The Latin language had produced in Spain some of the highest literary expressions of its time, the poetic and philosophical works of Lucan and Seneca. Not surprising for a region that had also politically regenerated the empire by giving birth to the great emperors Trajan and Hadrian, who were the light of their time. But after the fall of the empire, the first great contribution from others was the hubbub. The word hubbub today means, for us, an incomprehensible bustle, but originally it was simply the name of the Arabic language. When Islam brought its refined architectures, its rooms with fountains, its philosophers and its dromedaries to the dryness of Granada and Córdoba, 7 centuries it projected its refinement on Christian culture, it was also leaving the sounds of its language in the neighboring language. This influence filled Spanish poetry with a new musicality, as well as enriched philosophical possibilities that were later largely frustrated by Christian dogmatism and the hooks of its courts during the Inquisition. Europe was barbaric when Islam was a refined civilization, whose physiologists established some foundations of modern medicine, whose mathematicians were the most outstanding of the time, whose philosophers Averroes and Avicenna recovered the work of Aristotle, forgotten by the West, whose storytellers brought tones fantastic and imagination excessively restricted by the church and the village spirit. Perhaps it has been a vestige of Arabic poetry, which venerates musicality in language as a virtue in itself, not necessarily dependent on a sense in the way that arabesques are pictorial music and not representation of images or ideas, which it allowed the emergence of poetic adventures such as that of Gongora, crystal weaver, and capricious verbal architect. But around the time of discovery, the poets Juan Boscan and Garcilaso de la Vega accepted the challenge of a Venetian ambassador to bring to Spanish the musicality of the Italian language, the rhythms and forms of poetry that Petrarca had refined with his sonnets. The troubadours with their songs, and Dante with the triplets of his journey through the fetid pits of hell, the musical rocks of purgatory and the terraces of paradise, supported by columns of the righteous and the wings of angels. There began the Spanish Golden Age, which sang of love at once sensual and mystical in the voice of Saint John of the Cross, who wove with delicate music indelible thoughts in the voice of Fray Luis de Leon, who reasoned deeply and moralized in the harmonious hendecasyllables of Quevedo, who knew how to be flexible and passionate in the verses of Lope de Vega, who built the admirable periods in their sonority and diligence of Luis de Gongora, and who finally gathered his expressive force and his ability to testify to the once the death of one era and the birth of another, by founding in the work of Cervantes the typical literary genre of the modern age, the novel. Already with the contribution of Arabic and Italian, the language had been able to perpetuate in language the very emergence of modernity. But both Spanish and Portuguese were also faced with the greatest challenge that any language had ever experienced in all of history, the challenge of naming a totally unknown world. A whole continent, with its jungles and rivers, with climates and its mountain ranges, with its peoples and its cultures, with its gods and its centuries, with its songs, its wars and its mythologies, suddenly emerged before the bewildered eyes of Europe, and although many in the courts of the Old World, and even among the philosophers, scholars, and poets of the day, did not realize the magnitude of the problems and challenges that this discovery posed for the whole of civilization, the age made much of it. Men, faced by chance with tasks that normally did not correspond to them, captured and witnessed the eruption of America in the sensibility of the West, its incorporation into the known universe, and the many themes that it opened for the sensibility, for the imagination and for the thought. There the world saw an age in which humble soldiers became great creators of language, in which merchants became storytellers, in which hungry adventurers found the poetry of blood and gold. Many historians have wondered why so few of the great sages and great writers of Europe came to live direct experience of the American world, and why they almost always had to be warriors of medium culture and chroniclers of not exquisite training. Who was given to recognize this world, describe the first clash of cultures and preserve for centuries the testimony of those auroras of blood. The world knows how to improvise its poets and its conductors when it needs them. Given the circumstances of the time, given the dogmatisms and rigors of the Inquisition, I dare to think that it was not so bad that it was those modest characters in their formation who wove the vast cosmos of the chronicles of the Indies and painted the bloody tapestry of the time. Perhaps the philosophers and sages, trained in a more rigid tradition than the inexperienced wrote us, and that the unsuspecting adventurers would have seen less than the chroniclers saw, and perhaps they would have inscribed it in a language more devoid of the formalities of the time. In a less perceptive way. Many chroniclers of the Indies, like many of the authors of the Icelandic warrior sagas, drew their resources from life more than the habits of tradition, and were enormously inventive because their literary twists were often driven by the very vertigo of events. The truth is that thanks to those authors, Bernal Díaz del Castillo and Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, Bartolomé de las Casas and Cieza de León, Juan de Castellanos and Fray Pedro Simon, among so many memorable witnesses of the early days of America, the substance of a world that we will not see again and the whirlwind of an unrepeatable time were saved for posterity and represented a new contribution to the process of enrichment of the language. But what was happening was the formation of a new world era. Due to the discovery of America, the confirmation of the roundness of the planet and the relativization of many old truths thanks to the questions that this discovery brought with it. Great sages, throughout history, had suggested and even demonstrated the roundness of the planet, but it is one thing to think about it and another thing to live it. Only at the beginning of the 16th century, humanity began to truly live in a sphere, and the conquest of the consciousness of that sphere would still be slow, since we can affirm that humanity was always capable of living, not in the fullness of a worldview but rather in bits and pieces of different worldviews, roughly assembled to produce an illusion of coherence. It was only in the late 20th century that we could see the Catholic Church accepting Galileo's truths, and the fact had surprising overtones because the Church, undoubtedly sincere in its contrition, graciously decided to forgive Galileo. 5 centuries later, when the only sensible thing to do was it would have been asking for forgiveness. So the fact that truths are proven does not guarantee that humanity really incorporates them into its daily reality, and it seems that the world lives spontaneously in a fog mixed with certainties and fantasies, to which often they only give coherence myths. The gold and silver of America were decisive in the consolidation of the mercantile society. More than 20,000 tons of Mexican and Peruvian silver, and an indeterminate amount of tons of gold from New Granada and other regions, were undoubtedly a gigantic flow, which ran through the veins of Europe, and which greatly contributed to the formation of modern capitalism. It is still moving to see those gold statues in the Seville Cathedral, in which the molten gold of the solar gods of America entered the cult of the Christian God, but it was at the hands of German bankers, English pirates, and merchants of Flanders that went to stop most of that wealth that did not make fortune of Spain. We also know that contact with American cultures, despite the barbarism with which they were destroyed, was the basis for the meditations of Bartolomé de las Casas and Francisco de Victoria, which gave rise to humanitarian law, inspired the reflections of Montaigne, one of the pillars of modernity. I stimulate the elaboration of the utopia of Tomás Moro. He revived the old European myths, the legend of the City of Gold, the legend of the country of the Amazons, the island of the Fountain of Eternal Youth, the reefs of the Sirens and the dream of the country of Cinnamon. That world finally nourished in Rousseau the legend of the good savage and the cult of nature that would inspire the dreams and landscapes of Romanticism, and which would be one of the main stimuli for the emergence of ethnology and anthropology, disciplines that have changed the sensibilities of contemporary societies. All that was, then, a fullness, but also a beginning. Where the task of imperial Spain ended at that time, which, as Hegel would say, due to its decline, there was the beginning of the American cultural adventure, but since then centuries passed before both Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula returned to find yourself at the heart of the story. I dare not claim that this has fully occurred. I believe that our cultures are preparing for a great future, and I believe that the centuries that we have lived have been centuries of complex and excessive gestation, but it is now possible to see that ours is no longer a marginal region of the world, and not to insist on long historical accounts. I simply want to reflect on some isolated elements. One very important one is that despite the enormous political and economic fragmentation of our countries, it is possible to notice that every time large cultural movements emerge, they occur simultaneously throughout the entire continent. When the enlightened generation that prepared independence arose, when the battles of freedom were fought, the destinies of great men of these lands were continental destinies. That generation of Latin American patriots shocked the world, and there is no doubt that at the beginning of the 19th century, our countries were a prominent part of world history. It is not only because we find the statue of Bolívar on the Alexander III Bridge in Paris, or in the center of a square in Cairo, or in Central Park in New York. It is not only because in the encyclopedic accounts of the great events of the millennium, not because they are slightly less significant, it is noted that the two great moments in Latin America that appear are the Age of Conquest and the Age of Independence. It is evident that, although America was incorporated into world history since the discovery, and was already inconceivable without the contribution of Europe and Africa, only in the last years of the 18th century, and in the first years of the 19th, did it seem to become aware of his cosmic location, and seemed to make the decision to take fate in his hands. You have to listen to the way Bolívar spoke to perceive the magnitude of his historical consciousness and the fine perception he had of his time and of the way we belonged to the world. We are a small human race, Bolívar wrote in the letter to Jamaica, we have a world apart, surrounded by vast seas, new in almost all arts and sciences, although somewhat old in the ways of civil society. I consider the current state of America, as when the Roman Empire collapsed, each dismemberment formed a political system, according to its interests and situations or following the particular ambition of some heads, families, or corporations, with this notable difference, that those dispersed members were re-establishing their old nations with the alterations that things or events demanded, but we, who barely conserve vestiges of what once was, and who on the other hand are neither Indians nor Europeans, but a middle species between the legitimate owners of the country and the Spanish usurpers, in short, we are Americans by birth and our rights are those of Europe, we have to dispute these with those of the country and we must remain in it against the invasion of the invaders. Thus we find ourselves in the most extraordinary and complicated case, despite the fact that it is a kind of divination to indicate what will be the result of the policy line that America follows. I dare to venture some conjectures, which, of course, I characterize as arbitrary, dictated by irrational desire and not by probable reasoning. Like Humboldt, one of the things that most concerned Bolívar was the tremendous inequality that was inherited from the colony. In almost 2 countries, indigenous peoples had been stripped of their rich tradition, of their consciousness of being at the center of a world, of their dignity, and hastily turned into worshippers of a mental order in which they would never be seen in conditions of life. Equality. Due to their tremendous arrogance, the crown, the businessmen, and the church were willing to have subjects, to have servants and to have faithful, but not to allow a process of dignification of human beings to take place here, and even less of exaltation of free beings, capable of judgment and judgment. For centuries the Catholic Church would continue to prohibit free reading in America, which had been the instrument of the Enlightenment to build a civic conscience and a responsible individual capable of supporting the scaffolding of the republics. Bolívar continually wondered about how to found a political order in which serfs and slaves had access to freedom, discriminated Creoles agreed to equality, and both agreed to fraternity, principles that were so eloquently proclaimed in France by the canons of the Revolution. But if it was difficult in Paris to make the French agree to freedom, equality, and fraternity, in Paris, where they were all part of a homogeneous nation with more than 4 centuries of unified existence, united by a long tradition, what to expect from peoples made up of Indians, Creoles, and blacks, mestizos, mulattoes and zambos? What to expect from those Creoles who are more willing to gain notoriety and power than to live with the mulatto and the Indian? What to expect from those remnants of old native cultures? What to do with those syncretic religions? What to do with the rich patriots who were willing to fight for independence, but not to free their many slaves? What do you do with those miners and landowners who made a living by sending their metals and their products from Spain? What to do with those merchants who lived off the exchange with the metropolises? What to do with those who had learned the 1,000 nuances of the bureaucratic trap, with the already flourishing tradition of sinuous legalism, that empire of legalists who tightened and retightened the nuts of the law to thrive on their gaps and parasitize on its ambiguities? It is known that many indigenous people resisted the idea of independence because they feared, with good reason, that the mestizos who would take over states could become more exclusive and more contemptuous of Indians, blacks, and mulattoes, than the Spaniards themselves. Also in his time, many slaves rejected the incomprehensible idea that slavery was abolished, since without extensive and long pedagogical and social work to change values, build an ethic of equality, and offer effective educational opportunities, political, legal and economic, the freedom of slaves was limited, as Estanislao Zuleta has said, to leaving them free of food and shelter. The path that Bolívar saw was the path of generosity. He believed in the need for a slow and paternal pedagogical work that would teach races, social classes, regions, and traditions to live together, promoting the best of all of them and establishing that creative dialogue within the framework of a rich legislation and guarantees, which would allow them to overcome in a short time the trauma of a century of savage conquests and 2 centuries of colonial arrogance. I wish more than any other to see the greatest nation in the world form in America, less for its size and wealth than for its freedom and glory. Although I aspire to the perfection of the government of my country, I cannot persuade myself that the New World is for the moment ruled by a great republic, as it is impossible, I do not dare to wish it, and even less I wish a universal monarchy in America, because this project, without being useful, is also impossible. the abuses that currently exist would not be reformed and our regeneration would be fruitless. The American states have needed the care of paternal governments that heal the sores and wounds of despotism and war. Just as there had always been a Caribbean America, an Andean America and an Amazonian America, an America of the northern deserts and an America of the southern pampas, a white America, an Indian America and a black America had also been defined. Or better yet, a predominantly white Euro-America, like Argentina or Chile, an indigenous and mestizo Indo-America, in Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador, Peru or Bolivia, a predominantly black and mulatto Afro-America, in Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, or Brazil. This did not mean that all countries were not mestizo to a greater or lesser degree, but from that original composition derived many elements that characterized their cultures. Each of these Americas would have unique elements to contribute to the mosaic of civilization, and it was impossible for the solution of these conflicts to come about through the almost magical discovery of a political system suited to their needs. All political systems are the fruit of tradition and experience, and Mestizo America was a new experiment in world history. The conquest of its formal independence would be just the first step in a long search that required the experiment of social coexistence within the framework of new laws, economic strengthening governed by the ideal of autonomy and cultural independence. Simon Rodriguez said well that we would only find solutions when we did not think of ourselves as different from one country to another and when we did not believe in more borders than the natural borders of the continent. 2 centuries later, these conditions have not yet been fully met for the existence of the continent as a solidarity nation with firm commitments and shared responsibilities regarding the fate of the world, but despite the apparent chaos, we have made much progress. The miscegenation, which was our great difficulty, is also our great opportunity on the stage of contemporary culture, since the trend towards miscegenation is one of the main characteristics of modernity. The world no longer has towards any form of racial or cultural purity, but towards all kinds of fusions. This explains the value of mestizo cultures as full faces of the time. Its challenges are the most pressing, since in the face of the persistent danger of fascism, which seek to claim the superiority of pure races, pure languages, single religions, or homogeneous cultures, and which absurdly intend to impose them on the whole world, the only alternative is to find the value of the mergers and show the mestizo civilization as the most likely face of the future. Thus, our countries, on which the hegemonic power of certain cultures wrought so many atrocities and so many violence, have been forced before any other to be the laboratories of that new planetary age. That was what he pointed to, from a time when neither ethnology nor anthropology had given cultures their vindication and justification, the ideology of that great man of action and great dreamer of futures that was the liberator Bolívar. There is in his ideas more a dark luck intuition than a precise conceptual development. Twinning by tradition and by language, the day may not be far off when the still hazy dream of a unity of nations of our America, as outlined in those final words of the Letter of Jamaica, will be fulfilled. It is a great idea to pretend to form a single nation from the entire New World with a single bond that links its parts to each other and to the whole. Since it has an origin, a language, some customs, and a religion, it should, therefore, have a single government that will confederate the different states that are to be formed, but it is not possible, because remote climates, remote situations, diverse situations, opposing interests, dissimilar characters, divide America. How beautiful it would be if the Isthmus of Panama were for us what Corinth was for the Greeks. Hopefully one day we will have the fortune to install there an august Congress of the representatives of the republics, kingdoms, and empires to discuss the high interests of peace and war, with the nations of the other parts of the world. This kind of corporation may take place at some happy time in our regeneration. Another hope is unfounded, similar to that of the Abbé St. Pierre, who conceived the laudable delusion of meeting a European Congress to decide on the fate and interests of those nations. In our time, however, we have seen how the states of Europe, much more different from each other, and traditionally most confronted by wars, religious conflicts, and cultural differences, have arrived at the gates of a confederation. At the end of the 19th century, another admirable generation took on the challenge of seeking our entrance into modernity. It was also there in the field of language, and in particular of literature, where this effort was made to break the rigid schemes of societies that had lost their planetary vocation and had locked themselves in their lethargic dream of villages, sometimes idyllic, but often violent and fratricidal. In Mexico, in Havana, in Bogotá, in Lima, in Santiago de Chile, in Buenos Aires, the renewing voices of Manuel Gutiérrez Nájera, José Martí, José Asunción Silva, José María Eguren, Ricardo James Freire, Leopoldo Lugones began to emerge. Its themes, its rhythms, the grace of its language, the elasticity of its cadences, the richness of its prose, allowed us to glimpse that a true revolution of sensibility was taking place there. Two simultaneous events were remarkable: one, the continental character of his adventure and his search; another, the fact that they all seemed to draw on the same sources, on the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe and Heinrich Heine, but mainly on contemporary French poetry, on the voices of Victor Hugo, Baudelaire, and especially Paul Verlaine. An extraordinarily musical poet, given to passion and disorder, but full of life, grace, and authenticity. Paul Verlaine, drunk, selfish, turbulent, unstable, but vigorous, delicate, passionate and brilliant, was a kind of remote portrait of the state of mind of the Ibero-American writers of the end of the century. They learned many things from him. Thanks to its influence, they transformed the language, made it more expressive, more harmonious, more nuanced, more irreverent and more sensual. What was coming to us was a language for passion that was as if contained in countries full of cultural richness and human diversity, but silenced for a long time by colonialism and later by the narrow-mindedness of a village politics. Now we were poking our heads back into the reality of the planet. The most prominent member of that literary generation, the Nicaraguan Rubén Darío, not only brought to their fullness in verse and prose many of the partial conquests of his friends and colleagues, but was also the one chosen by destiny to take to Spain. The evidence of this adventure of modernity. When he arrived in Madrid in 1898, Spain had just experienced its war with the United States, it had lost its last possessions in the Caribbean, the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico, its last possessions in the Pacific, the Philippine Islands, and with them it had lost the last vestiges of his world empire. The old Spanish literary generations succumbed to prostration in a disenchanted country, but the new ones were eager to meet the world and to build a modern Spain, adapted to the time, capable of fully living the new adventure of no longer being an almost empire. Fictional, but one of the most original nations in Europe. There Rubén Darío found those young people, Antonio Machado and Miguel de Unamuno, Juan Ramón Jiménez and Ramón del Valle Inclán, also great readers of French, renovating sensibilities, eager for the future. That meeting bore great fruit, and just as the generation of Latin American modernists had found in Dario's sensitivity, talent, and generosity the ideal spokesperson to represent them before Spain, the new Spanish writers found in him their best emissary for America. Rubén Darío became not only the symbol of Latin American modernism, but also the symbol of an unexpected convergence of the two wings of the language, on both sides of the Atlantic. And it is because that contact occurred, because at that fortunate moment that dialogue was possible, which is why the Castilian language, which had passed almost in silence for 2 centuries and which the rest of the great languages of Europe lived the splendor of its creativity, the centuries of classicism, rationalism, and romanticism, and had ceased to be an instrument of the great adventures of the spirit, it rediscovered its destiny as a great language of civilization, and undertook, throughout the 20th century, the adventure that has made it not only in the third language in the world, after Mandarin and English in quantity, but in one of the most vigorous of modern times, one of the languages that will have to assume the responsibility of the future in a leading way on the planet, the tasks of reflection, creation, and communication that lie before us at this crossroads of the centuries. In 1936, the great Mexican writer and thinker Alfonso Reyes delivered in an international forum, and published in the magazine Sur, from Buenos Aires, some reflections on the way our elders perceived their destiny as children of this continent. The immediate generation that precedes us, was still believed to have been born within the prison of various concentric fatalities. The most pessimistic felt like this: in the first place, the first great fatality, which consisted of course in being human, according to the sentence of the old Silenus collected by Calderon, because the major crime / of man is to have been born. Within this, came the second circle, which consisted of having arrived very late in an old world. The echoes of that romanticism that Cuban Juan Clemente Zanilla summarizes in 2 verses have not yet faded: my times are those of ancient Rome, / and my brothers with Greece have died. In the world of our lyrics, a sentimental anachronism dominated average people. It was the third circle, above the misfortunes of being human and being modern, the very specific one of being American, that is, born and rooted in a soil that was not the current focus of civilization, but a branch of the world. To use a word from our Victoria Ocampo, the grandparents felt like owners of a soul without a passport. And since one was an American, another handicap in the race of life was being Latino or, in short, having a Latino cultural background. It was the time of a quotient la superiorite des Anglo-Saxons. It was the time of submission to the present state of things, with no hope of definitive change or faith in redemption. Only Rodo's harangues could be heard, noble and candid. Since he belonged to the Latin world, a new fatality within him belonged to the Hispanic world. The old lion had been down for a long time. Spain seemed to be back from its former greats, skeptical and helpless. The sun had set in their domain. And, to top it all, the Spanish-American did not get along with Spain, as happened until recently, even before the present pain in Spain, which hurts us all. Within the Hispanic world we still come to be a dialect, derivation, secondary thing, branch again, the Hispanic American, a name that is tied with a hyphen, as with a chain. Among the Hispanic Americans, those close to me still regretted having been born in the area loaded with Indians. The Indian, then, was a burden, and not yet a haughty duty and a strong hope. Within this region, those still closest to me had reason to grieve that they had been born in the fearful neighborhood of a thriving and thriving nation, a sentiment now transformed into the priceless honor of representing the front of a race. Of all these ghosts that the wind has been carrying away or the daylight has been redrawing until they become, at least, acceptable realities, something still remains in the corners of America, and you have to chase it by opening the windows wide and wide. Calling superstition by name, which is the way to drive it away. But, in substance, all this is already rectified. Having established the previous premises and after this examination of the case, I dare to assume a style of legal argument. There has been a feeling of equalization and equality between Spain and us for a long time. And now I say before the tribunal of international thinkers that listens to me, we recognize the right to universal citizenship that we have already achieved. We have come of age. Very soon you will get used to counting on us. So far the text of Alfonso Reyes. I dare to affirm that that time has come, and Alfonso Reyes himself is one of the forgers of this age in which the specific way of thinking and the very diverse style of creation of our cultures has begun to become indispensable to the world. The 20th century was the century in which Latin America went from invisibility and remoteness to being at the center of the dramas of the contemporary world, but also at the center of its spiritual adventures. Nobody can ignore that our current presence in the international arena is deeply marked by the difficulties of our reality, by the persistence of very modern evils. Nobody can ignore the existence of drug trafficking, terrorism, political and economic exiles. But these facts must not be allowed to overshadow or nullify another great truth, that of the vigor and growing validity of our cultures, the way in which we are reinterpreting the tradition of the West, and the unmistakable flavor that our creations already have. It is impossible to conceive the literature of the 20th century, without thinking, among many others, of Jorge Luis Borges, João Guimarães Rosa, Pablo Neruda, Juan Rulfo, or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Each of them not only represents the expression of a region, of a sensitivity, one of the irreplaceable faces of this sort of Latin planet. Borges, voice of a country of immigrants, figures in his works the cosmopolitanism of America, his infinite curiosity for all cultures, his right to inherit all traditions, his cult for the accumulated memory of libraries and symbols, and at the same time his Adamic perplexity by a world always unexplained, the point at which art and philosophy are linked to produce, not certainties that overwhelm and silence but privileged states of amazement and gratitude. Rolfo, the voice of an apparently abolished indigenous world, gives rise in his poetry to the spectral rumor of a reality where life and death are linked, where time is at the same time a breath of wakefulness and sleep, and where intimacy and history dialogue in the stark language of elemental emotions. Neruda and Gimeri's Rosa show us the turbulence of a world where nature still exists in a sense that many regions of the planet have already lost, a nature that language haunts and never fully reaches. They show us the eternal American adventure of trying to name with a language that is always insufficient. Human, the central task of all poetry. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, voice of the multiple universe of the Caribbean, fuses the musicality of the Castilian language with the disconcerting magical thinking of indigenous peoples and with the joy and sensuality of African cultures, to produce the splendor of the mestizo novel, the saga of a world where perhaps only the complicity of forbidden loves manages to survive the traps of language, the arbitrariness of power and the winds of doom. If these authors, and so many others, have made their way into the hearts of their contemporaries throughout the world, it is because the syntheses mentioned by Alfonso Reyes have not ceased to occur in our culture, because Latin America is beginning to have answers for the world, and it will have them more and more to the extent that it assumes all its wealth, the wisdom and the sum of knowledge of its indigenous peoples, the vigor, joy, and sense of rhythm of its African American peoples, the deep trace of civilizations of its Iberian and Latin past, and the growth contribution of the cultures that have come to us to stay. We can affirm that Ibero-America has entered into a dialogue of equality with the world in the field of culture. Perhaps it will not take long for this cultural exchange to also become a true economic and political exchange, and something much more important and more urgent, in a dialogue, on equal terms with the rest of the world, on the directions of human civilization and the future of the planet. And the new centers of the sphere. William Ospina.